Really excited to have him here today. Please give a warm welcome to Dan Harris.
Thanks for having me. Nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you too, Dan. Thank you so much for being here. So the title of today's event is Self-Love for Skeptics. And for those who follow you, they'll know that your work is really heavily focused around this idea of loving better, living better. And I have tons of questions for you around this along with our member audience. Thank you to those who have already submitted questions. Please continue to share some of those and we'll add them into the conversation. But before we dive into all of that, I'd love to first hear more about how you do this work and why you do this work. So as I noted, you host the 10% Happier podcast and you wrote a book of the same name. For the uninitiated, what does 10% happier mean? And how does this term capture the ethos of the work that you do that you've really dedicated your life to doing?
Well, it kind of started as a joke. I got interested in meditation in the aughts, a little bit before it became socially acceptable. It was one of the few times in my life I've ever been ahead of a trend. I think in the summer of 2010, I did my first meditation retreat. And I came back from that, and one of my friends in the office was peppering me with very skeptical questions, basically asking, what's the matter with you? Like, why would you do this? And I was searching for some sort of answer. And I said, it makes me like 10% happier. And I could see that the look on her face transformed from, something approaching contempt to something approaching interest. And I thought, okay, well, that's my shtick. And I like it because even though it's a bit tongue in cheek, it's a reasonable description of how meditation can improve your life and lots of other modalities, including therapy and improving your relationships, getting better sleep, eating well. There are all these things that we know from the science are good for us. And yet they can sometimes be very difficult to do. And we'll talk about habit formation for sure. And they can also sometimes be sold to us as panaceas. And so one of the things I was trying to do is to counter programming against the sort of reckless hope and hype that is spread in the darker precincts of the self-help world. So yeah, I wanted to make a realistic promise. And I will add one last thing, which is that like any good investment, the 10% compounds annually. That these, the radical good news here, and I spent much of my career disseminating bad news as a news anchor. But the radical good news here is that the mind is trainable. That in fact, I would argue that all of the states of mind that we want, calm, generosity, compassion, happiness, equanimity. These are not unalterable factory settings. They are skills that can be practiced through meditation and other, to use this word again, other modalities. So that's the 2-minute elevator pitch for 10%.
I mean, the thing I really like about that is that it sort of speaks to this idea of a journey, right? That you're not going to, there aren't things you instantly do to become fully happier, it's incremental, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, I wish that were the case. But, all these people making millions of dollars selling books promising, overnight success or whatever, they're the only ones profiting, and if there was an overnight fix, why are they writing multiple books? It doesn't make any sense. This is, learning how to do life better, which is one of the little phrases that I use a lot, do life better. Learning how to do that is messy. It involves messy marginal improvement over time. So the good news is that you can change. The bad news is that it's difficult. And then the good news again is that there are ways to make it easier and fun and enjoyable. And all of this has been studied, by people much smarter than me. My job is essentially, in one aspect of my job, is to be a kind of gateway drug as a professional communicator who's looked at the scientific research and has spent a decent amount of time studying contemplative traditions, especially Buddhism, to be a gateway drug who can sum up what I've learned and then hopefully direct you deeper to experts who know more than I do.
Well, to the point of today's conversation, in doing this work and having these conversations and being this gateway drug, what has the work revealed to you about why self-love is so hard for so many of us?
Well, um, let me just say that I even after I got interested in meditation, I was not particularly interested in love or self-love. You said something at the beginning that you, Dan, are interested in how to love better, and that is true. And I hear those words, and I'm like, does that mean really? I'm like a pretty stereotypical male in many ways. And so I didn't, when I first started getting interested in meditation and really the larger Buddhist context for meditation, you hear a lot about love and compassion. There's this word loving kindness that gets used a lot. And I really struggled with that. It didn't speak to me. However, there are lots of ways in here. One of them is that we tend to beat ourselves up. I don't know that there's a definitive answer for why we do that, but I think there are a couple of reasonable theories. One is that we live in a I'm not anti-capitalist, although I think there are some good questions to be raised about capitalism and some of its impacts on the mind. But in a capitalistic, individualistic society where advertising has infiltrated our minds in so many ways, we are kind of sold this idea that we're never gonna be enough unless we make that next purchase, and then you ramp that up through social media, where we are our innate tendency to compare ourselves to the people around us, and also to experience FOMO when we're not part of something, just gets put on steroids. As a friend of mine has said, it's a kind of ego itching powder, and that all ladders up to a world in which we spend a lot of time, I think probably more in Western contexts than in Eastern contexts, but we spend a lot of time running ourselves down. And many of us, and myself included, believe that this is necessary in order to get off the couch and get anything done. However, what the research shows is that that's not true.
Well, and I can't wait to get into what is true and sort of how we can think better about this and approach all of this in a better way. And I think that this conversation feels especially timely right now. I sort of suggested at the top that we're a few weeks away from the beginning of the year, where everyone's really energized and running headfirst towards these goals. And then also, we are just 2 days shy of the Day of Love, right? Valentine's Day, where people are giving lots of thought to these things. Do you find that during this time of year, people maybe struggle more with this idea of self-love than other parts of the year?
Well, for sure, that it has not escaped my attention that we start the year, many of us, with these lofty ambitions and goals for making all sorts of changes in our lives, and then within weeks, the vast majority of us fall off the wagon, and that suggests there's something awry here. And then I would say about Valentine's Day. I'm all for romantic love. I'm happily married, 17 years. And I do think it focuses us on a narrow band of love. In other languages, there are many different words for different kinds of love. In our language, as I said in my TED Talk, we use the same word to talk about romantic love, familial love, and our feelings for gluten-free snickerdoodles. And that creates a lot of confusion. When in fact, you can taxonomize love into, as I said, familial love, romantic love, unconditional love for all beings, which is actually on offer, believe it or not just for saints, friendship, self-love. And I think that if we can get a more capacious, nuanced understanding of love, it will be to our benefit, especially if we can then understand that all these different types of loves are not, to echo the language I used earlier, not unalterable factory settings, but in fact skills. That is where things get, I think, really helpful.
And I think for a lot of people, it seems that it makes sense, right? Like loving yourself is a good place to start for just being a better person. But I imagine that there are barriers that all of us face, and that you maybe see some of the same ones again and again. What would you point to as some of the big barriers and the big hurdles for people to practice self-love?
Well, first of all, it's just cheesy. Let's just be honest. I mean, it's if love is the ultimate cliche, self-love is, taking it to the next level. And it's, I think the concept can seem like the type of thing that's written into latte foam art, and therefore very annoying to many people. Or maybe I'm just speaking for myself here, but that's one of the turnoffs. The other is that, as I referenced earlier, I think many of us believe that we need to kick our own ass in order to get anything done. And this is a really deeply held belief. I would say on a deeper level, and this is probably subconscious, I've heard it argued by my friend Tara Brach, who's a great meditation teacher and psychotherapist, that there's a kind of addiction with self-hatred and self-loathing and self-criticism, where it gives us a sense of control in a world that can feel out of our control. So that dynamic might not be conscious one, but it's interesting to investigate whether that's maybe happening subconsciously for you.
Well, obviously, if you've joined this conversation, you are bought into some extent in wanting to try this for yourself, to try to love yourself better. And you maybe are that skeptic that we're referencing in the title here. But I imagine that this is very different from person to person. We all have different experiences and different goals. And there are probably different ways that you go about loving yourself. But are there some basic ground rules for self-love that really apply to everyone as a starting point?
Well, let me start with the science. So, and this is really, for somebody like me who's naturally quite skeptical, this is what kind of gets me in the door. Self-compassion is a booming field of modern psychological research. The woman who really pioneered this, her name is Kristen Neff. She's a researcher at the University of Texas. And so she does, to me, is a heroic, if not historic figure, honestly, for coming up with this concept and then leading the research into it. And what it shows is that people who well, let me define what it is. And I with my apologies to Kristen, I might be mangling this, or it might be just focusing on one aspect of it. But I think of self-compassion as the ability to talk to yourself the way you would talk to a good friend. Most of us use an inner drill sergeant to drive ourselves, but Kristen would recommend you move to an inner coach. A coach does not let you off the hook. A coach is not overlooking your mistakes. He or she just isn't a jerk about it. And that's the difference. So this is not about, putting yourself in a forever bubble bath or lowering your standards. This is just about a tweak in your inner posture vis-a-vis yourself. We all have this ability to be a good friend or mentor to our children, people in our work life, wherever. We all have this ability. And what Kristen's research has shown, among other things, is that you can channel this inward. So how would you do that? So there's a lot to say about this, but let me just start with what Kristen calls the mindful self-compassion break. I call it the Neff 3-step, named after her. She does not co-sign on that nomenclature. Anyway, there are 3 steps, and it's super easy to do. The first is just to notice when you're kicking your own ass. That's the first step. Just the mindfulness of the fact that this is happening. Just catching, oh yeah, I am in a toilet vortex of self-recrimination right now. That's the easy first step. The second is to bring to mind the fact that you are not alone. Whatever you're criticizing yourself for. So for me, it might be like, I don't like the way I look in the mirror. Or I said something stupid last night. Both of those, I probably went through both of those cycles today. So that kind of thing, you notice that that's happening, and then you bring to mind the fact that millions of other people are in this same place right now. You are not alone. This is a very common human experience. And then the third step for me is the most important, which is at that point, you talk to yourself the way you would talk to a good friend. And a couple of ways to supercharge this. One is to put your hand on your heart. And again, here I will invoke again my conditioning as a straight white male. Putting my hand on my heart was not something that came easily to me. And yet there is data to show that, in Kristen's term, you are bringing online what she calls the mammalian care system. You are. We know that appropriate touch with other people can release all sorts of hormones and do good things for the nervous system. You can do this with yourself. So that's one. You can even hug yourself if you're. If nobody's looking, and then when you talk to yourself, now I'm going to bring in somebody else's research. There's another great researcher named Ethan Kross who I have a lot of admiration for. He's at the University of Michigan, and he's studied internal chatter and ways to change your own internal chatter. And one of the things he's shown is that if you use your own name, he calls this distant self-talk. If you can use your own name when you're talking to yourself, it gives the subsequent words more weight because it's almost as if it's coming from somebody else. And so for me, I just say, dude, I know what you're worried about me. For example, I get a lot of claustrophobia. So I worry about if I've got a day in the city where I'm going to take a lot of elevators or I'm going to be on a plane or something. Like, dude, I know you're worried, but like, you're good. You've been through this a million times. Even if you start to panic, these are physical sensations you've experienced a million times before and you're still alive. You got this. Just a little pep talk like that. If you can get over, if this strikes you as cheesy, if you can get over yourself to do that, just know that there's a ton of research to show that this is really good for you and that it has knock-on effects, like it makes you better able to keep your resolutions or to keep up whatever habit you're trying to establish at any time, at New Year's or any other time. So we're at, as you said before, we're at a moment where a lot of people are falling off the wagon with their resolutions. Self-compassion has been shown to be a key variable in success for habit change. I think of it as like the Uber habit, the upstream habit that makes all of the other habits possible. And then the other thing is that self-compassion has been shown to increase your level of compassion for other people. And that's meaningful because probably the strongest piece of evidence I've seen in the modern psychological research is that the most important variable in the most important variable in human flourishing or human happiness is the quality of your relationships. So this is not a self-indulgent thing. It improves your ability to relate to other people, which then redounds to your benefit, which then makes you better with other people. And that's a nice, as I called it in my TED Talk, a cheesy upward spiral that is really impactful.
I love all of that. I feel like there's so many things that you just shared there that I know I will be applying right away. I'm sure lots of other folks are resonating with that. And I want to touch on something you just shared now, this idea of loving yourself can enable you to love other people better. And I think when you hear the term self-love, it sort of evokes the sense that this is a solitary practice, that you're doing this on your own. But is it really, is there a component of self-love that requires you to have support from other people? And what does that look like?
I'm so glad you pointed this out because earlier you asked me to list some of what I think the blockers are to self-love. And I said something like, well, some people think it's cheesy. Other people really believe they need to kick their own ass. Other people might be engaging in self-criticism as a kind of subconscious habit that keeps them safe in some perverse way. But another one on that list would be, it can be understood as a kind of self-indulgence, as an egotism, and I think in some ways in which there are ways in which self-love can be described in our culture right now that might actually be fairly criticized as self-indulgence. But I think properly understood, self-love has geopolitical consequences because if your inner weather gets balmier, it will impact the way you treat other people, and that is not nothing. That absolutely is not nothing. We are in an interdependent world. We've always been in an interdependent world, but more so now, arguably, than ever. And so how you treat people in your orbit matters. And then where things, as I said before, where this gets cool and a kind of where there's a positive boomerang effect here is as your relationships improve, you will get happier. This we know. I mean, I love this study that was that's ongoing at Harvard. It's been going on for, I think, like 90 years. They've been studying multiple generations of people in the Boston area to get a sense of like what leads to a long and healthy and happy life. And the variable that comes screaming out of the data is the quality of your relationships. That is what keeps you alive and happy and successful. Why? Because stress generally is what kills us. And positive relationships are the best way to regulate stress. And this just makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint. I know there are a million TED Talks that talk about how we're social animals, but there's a reason why this is a trope that we keep coming back to. We evolved in bands, and we got to the top of the food chain, not because we have wings or talons or teeth, sharp teeth. We got there because we have this unique ability to cooperate and collaborate and communicate. And when you take that out of your repertoire in your life, you will suffer for very clear evolutionary reasons. So, to put it in a more positive term, if you can get better at relating to other people, it will redound to your benefit in really profound ways. So no, I do not think self-love is self-indulgent. And I do think that it absolutely is, in an odd way, a team sport.
And in your TED Talk, you talk about, for your own growth, how you've invited people in your world, both professionally, personally, to sort of help you in identifying the parts of yourself that you can improve upon. And I'm curious if for others who are really interested in thinking about how they can be critical in ways that are healthy and also are really committed to this journey of loving themselves, is it sort of the same? Would you recommend that they take a similar approach, maybe not as intense as the one you chose, but to call your mom and say, hey, Mom, I'm like on a journey to be kinder to myself and I need your support. What does that look like?
Okay. Yes. I see where you were going with this. It's a great question. Just to back up and explain what Whitney's talking about. Probably the most embarrassing thing that's ever happened to me, is that I had and I talk about this in the TED Talk, I had a 360 review. I suspect some of you know what that is, but for those of you who don't, this is a diabolical corporate tool, generally, that it's a kind of an anonymous survey that an executive coach or an executive coaching firm will swoop into some sort of work context, identify the target of the 360. Usually they've been told they need a 360, whatever executives in question here. And then they do an anonymous survey with that executives or individual contributors, bosses, peers, and direct reports. And the idea is to get a kind of holistic sense of your strengths and weaknesses. Because I'm a moron, although I guess that's not very self-compassionate talk, but because I have questionable judgment sometimes, did a 360 review that included many of my colleagues, but also my wife, my brother, and two of my close friends who are meditation teachers. And this was back in 2018. And the results came back to me in the form of a 39-page report filled with blind quotes. The first 11 pages were the good stuff. The rest of it, the vast majority of it, was devoted to the difficult stuff, including the fact that I was overwhelmed at work, which was making me unpleasant. I was overscheduling myself. I have a tendency to be stubborn and dismissive, especially when it comes to junior employees. And that was a surprise to me and something I spent a lot of time working on. And then a sense of that I can be kind of emotionally guarded, hard to read or to understand. And so I've spent the last 6.5 years really working on the deficiencies identified in this report. So that's the context. The question is that Whitney is getting at is, should we all be asking people in our lives for feedback? I mean, my short answer is yes. And you want to be careful because if the feedback is, many people don't know how to deliver feedback. And so it can be very painful experience. So for me, what really helped in gathering all of this feedback and incorporating into my life is that I had a great executive coach, whose name is Jerry Colonna, just as a shout out. And working with Jerry, and also like my own personal shrink, I've had the good fortune to be able to have an executive coach and a therapist. And I know not everybody has access to these kinds of resources, but that really helped me integrate this quite harsh feedback into my life in positive ways. Without that, it's possible to kind of coil up into yourself and to compartmentalize the feedback, or to put it in a drawer or light it on fire or whatever, and maybe not act on it. So yeah, if you're going to ask for feedback, which I recommend, I think asking for feedback is really important. I think it's about picking the right people to ask, and seeing if you can get support in your life that will help you integrate it. Does that make sense, Whitney?
100%. Yeah. It's first, it sounds like do not try this alone at home. It's important to sort of do this with some guardrails, whether that be an executive coach or just going into it, sort of knowing that people can be harsh and preparing yourself for that. But then also it seems like it's really important to get people to kind of buy into the fact that you're on this journey, that you're in a place mentally where you're maybe trying to approach yourself in a different way. And
yes.
and so I guess that's my next question is how do you get people to buy into it without it sounding to the point you made earlier, that it may feel woo-woo to people, or sort of out of the realm of like what other people might feel comfortable doing for themselves.
So you're asking like, how can I start integrating self-compassion or self-love into my life in a way that I'm communicating it clearly to the people around me so that I can have support and buy-in? That's
right. Yeah. So that they sort of, I guess, can be there with you as you're through this journey, acknowledging that you're not going through it in a vacuum, and you'll have other people impacted by it.
Well, I'd be curious to see what somebody like Kristen Neff has to say about this, but just based on my own experience with this, I think it's possible to identify allies in your world, and if that's possible, great. And I also think everybody's on their own thing, and not everybody is going to be excited about your personal improvement journey, to use the language of the day. And it may be the case that for the vast majority of people, you don't want to say anything because they don't necessarily need to know, or they may not care, they may not be supportive. So I would go about this in a reasonably careful way. I do think this is a team sport, but you want to pick your teammates carefully. And so, for example, like one of the pitfalls I'm hoping to steer people away from here, I guess, is it is possible for people to get interested in any number of self-improvement modalities, from meditation to self-compassion to exercise or whatever, and to immediately be a little bit grating to the people in their world. There's a great cartoon that ran in the New Yorker several years ago, and has two women having lunch, and one of them says to the other, "I've been gluten-free for a week and I'm already annoying." And I think that is a very common thing, and a pitfall into which I have fallen in the past. Like when I first got interested in meditation in 2009, I got quite evangelical about it around the house, which did not go down well with my wife, who was in her training as a medical fellow at that time. And I just didn't have enough. She didn't have enough time really to meditate, and so I didn't skillfully introduce the notion. And so there's a way in which if you've got some big personal project you're on, yes, it's great, and I think crucial to have allies, either people you're paying like therapists or people you really trust in your world. And I think you want to avoid advertising it to absolutely everybody.
That is totally fair. And I love the cartoon you shared, which I feel like perfectly illustrates what you're saying here. Well, I want to bring in some of our member questions because we have a ton, and people are really excited by what you're sharing here, Dan. So there's one here that was shared by both Annika B and Prince Kumar, which great name, by the way, where they ask, can you love yourself too much where it turns into being selfish instead of stable and agreeable?
I just don't think that's love. maybe it's a kind of self-obsession. If in some cases it might be pathological and somebody's on the narcissism spectrum. But I think just an understanding of love, just this is my opinion, is not one where real love doesn't manifest in an overlooking of a whitewashing of your shortcomings, because that's not good for you. So if you're talking about a self-love where a person is induced in themselves a sense of denial about areas for potential growth, that to me doesn't feel like real love. And also if it's a kind of self-love where you're telling yourself that you should do things that are damaging to other people, I don't think that's real love either, because as we established, the most important variable probably in human flourishing is the quality of your relationships, and that stance would damage your relationship. So it ultimately wouldn't be in your best interest. So yes, I think it's possible for there be misfirings and misapplications of this notion of self-love or self-compassion, and we're all going to screw it up, and we're all going to, this isn't, generally speaking, just to step back for a second, there was a great tweet a couple of years ago by a Zen master named Roshi Joan Halifax, who I'm an admirer of. And it had this very squiggly line. And then the caption was "the path." And I love that, because it's not like some escalator that goes on a glide path toward nirvana all the time. It's much bumpier. And so, yes, I think if you're interested in self-compassion or self-love, or frankly, anything like meditation or therapy, you're going to overcorrect sometimes, you're going to miss the mark sometimes. And so, yes, there may be times where you think you're engaging in self-compassion or self-love, and it actually slips over into self-indulgence. And hopefully you have people in your world who can say, whoa, that wasn't cool. And you should hopefully, I think a self-compassionate stance would allow you to take on board that criticism without catastrophizing, without slipping over into shame, which I kind of think of as a psychic constipation, where like nothing can happen when you're in this shame state and you're making it all about what a horrible person you are, instead of the self-compassionate stance, which would view difficult feedback as just another opportunity to learn and grow.
Mm. And I think to this point, there's a question from Jonathan R. That when you get to this place where this, if you're in this sort of shame state, Jonathan R. sort of refers to this as maybe hitting rock bottom, and maybe your development isn't going as you expect. Are there ways you sort of adjust the advice that you're giving when you're in a very dark place potentially? Like, how do you overcome those moments?
Look, I think this is where we reach the limits of my expertise, in that I'm not a mental health professional. Mm-hmm. What I would recommend, and just based on my own experience and my own intuition here, is that if you're in a true rock bottom scenario, you should seek professional guidance, if that is accessible to you. I think of self-compassion as good for like the worried well, the people who are not necessarily in an acute crisis. I think it can be very helpful if you're in an acute crisis as well, but I would also want in the mix there for you to have professional help, and not just be trying to freelance and apply these concepts without oversight. Because if you're in an acute mental health crisis or a life crisis, there may be other interventions that are also needed, like weekly therapy, perhaps even medication. And so I would see this as a piece of the puzzle. And generally, I mean, that just kind of ladders up to a larger point, which is that, as we discussed at the beginning, I don't think there are silver bullets. I think of self-compassion or self-love as one aspect of a healthy life, one lever you can pull that will improve your life, but it's one of many. So to get too fundamentalist about any one thing like meditation or nature or relationships or exercise or sleep is to miss the fact that these are all aspects of personal development that kind of work in concert. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense, and it feels like everyone should approach this and sort of assessing for themselves what makes the most sense, and only you know what you personally need. There's no sort of blanket way to approach this, and taking some things from here and some things from there. I feel like it's the best way to go. Well, I think in speaking more to this moment, we talked about being a few weeks removed from the beginning of the year, and also Valentine's Day being around the corner. And obviously, we've had a very eventful few weeks in the news. And that whether there are things that make you really happy, things that make you really terrified, it's just I feel like a roller coaster of feelings, I'd imagine, for many of us watching. And Gordon G asks about how we can learn to practice ways to calm yourself in the face of the news and things you see happening outside in the world.
Yes, so many. It's like, where to start? And do you want me to give a 20-minute answer? The thing that's coming to my mind, and I think this is actually very relevant to everything we've discussed, because this is a meditative practice that I'm going to recommend that is directly supportive of love, of self-love, and again, understanding self-love within the context of our relationality, the fact that we are these social animals. This is a practice that I actually talked about in the TED Talk, and has also been the subject of a lot of research. And it's called loving kindness meditation. Loving kindness is the modern translation of an ancient word, metta, M-E-T-T-A, not like the mega corporation that dominates so many of our lives. Metta, M-E-T-T-A. And I prefer the translation friendliness. And I love the idea that friendliness is a skill that you can train through this meditation technique. And the Buddha is said to have invented this style of meditation as an antidote to fear. And so it's directly relevant to this current moment, which is creating so much stress, fear, and anxiety for so many people. And again, I want to acknowledge, as Whitney did, there are people who love what's happening right now too. And whatever side you're on, and I put that word "side" in quotes, there really is so much anger and fear, sort of directed to the other, and this practice can help you no matter what your politics are. So it's yet another practice that, for me, given my conditioning, I found quite annoying when I first heard about it. But again, what got me over the hump is that there's a ton of research. So it works like this. You sit quietly. You can actually hurl yourself on the ground if you want. Just assume a comfortable position, close your eyes, and then you start by envisioning an easy person or even an animal. So some being, a little kid or a cat or a dog, some being that is easy to love, and you bring them to mind either visually or a felt sense in your body, sort of somatically, if that's what you prefer. And then you repeat 4 phrases. May you be happy, may you be safe, may you be healthy, may you live with ease. And then you move through a progression of being. So you start with an easy person, then you move to yourself. I love that because it's kind of a bait and switch where you get the juices going with your cat or dog, and then you switch. Once you're starting to feel some warmth, you switch in yourself, and then you move to a mentor, somebody who's helped you out in your life. Could be a teacher, if a parent, an uncle. If you don't have somebody like that, could be a sort of a world figure who you admire, the Dalai Lama, whoever. And then you move to a neutral person. Somebody who you see frequently but tend to overlook, and then a difficult person, probably not easy to come up with somebody who fits the bill. I often advise people to go with somebody mildly annoying, not, don't go straight to Pol Pot. And then the final category is all beings everywhere, everybody. And this exercise, this contemplative exercise, has been shown to have physiological, psychological, and even behavioral benefits. When you teach preschoolers loving kindness or friendliness meditation, they become more likely to give their stickers away to kids they do not like. And so I think this is a great way to relax the nervous system in turbulent political times. So that's just one idea. Like I said, I could go on, but I don't want to flood the zone. So I'll stop there.
That's great. And I feel like this idea of giving your stickers away to the kids you don't like is something that's definitely going to stick with me in thinking about how to better approach some of these things and how this can help. Well, I guess along some of the same lines, and you mentioned in explaining not meta, that social media, and there's a question from Edmilson about how social media can also help or hinder our ability to love ourselves. And is there a different, approach you would take there?
I think social media is really tricky. I'm not a Luddite, and so I always feel some reluctance to advise people to opt out of, huge aspects of modern life. Although, if that's your instinct, I completely support it. But I also want to recognize that for many people, that feels like too tall of an order. And yet, social media is really tricky because it does, with extreme prejudice, induce states of comparison, a kind of toxic comparing mind, and also FOMO. And then there's also a ton of advertisement on there. And again, I'm not like reflexively anti-advertisement, but the way advertising often works is to engender a sense of insufficiency so that you make a purchase. Not always, but often. And so social media is a tough spot for the mind. I would add one other thing, which is that the algorithms appear to reward outrage. So what's happened is we have this whole group of what have been called conflict entrepreneurs who swoop in and take advantage of the way the algorithm is structured to enrich themselves and to give themselves clout. And I mean, I think that's a really good thing to keep in mind, which is that there's a lot of money to be made off of making you unhappy, making you hate the people on the other quote unquote side, making you outraged about all the developments in the news, making you feel like you're not enough. There are huge societal forces that will profit off of this. So what do you do about it? I just off the top of my head, one thing is just the practice of gratitude, to remember, and Chris Anderson and I have talked about this on my podcast. Chris, the man who has been leading TED for quite a while. If you don't get suckered by the news industry, which I used to inhabit, and social media platforms that want you to believe everything sucks. The news and social media aren't spending that much time on all of the mundane good things that are happening all around us. That doesn't get a lot of coverage. And yet, small and large acts of kindness are unfolding all around us all the time. And so gratitude for the good things in your life and the good things in the world is a nice way to counter program. Even better, and this picks up on a book that Chris wrote, is to be a locus of positivity yourself. In other words, to engage in generosity or compassion. And this can be big things like giving big gifts of service or money, or it can be small things. One of the little mental exercises I ask people to do is, what is it like in your mind, if you're paying attention, when you hold the door open for somebody? It feels good. And that feeling is infinitely scalable. And so you can be a node of sanity in an insane world by just doing a 10% boost in your utility quotient to the people around you. So it doesn't even have to be grandiose in any way. And that, I think, will help you survive the next time you go on Instagram. And again, I'm not trying to say that Instagram is an unalloyed ill, because I don't believe that. I'm on Instagram. So I think it is a place where lots of eyeballs are and good things can be done there. And I know it can make a lot of people unhappy. And so how can you reduce that? I think gratitude and generosity are two big things. And then finally, I would add mindfulness, which is, again, this, I don't know if we talked about this, but I think of mindfulness as, I don't think we did. Mindfulness is just the ability we have to have the self-awareness of our thoughts and emotions so that we're not so carried away by them. And so if you have that self-awareness as you're on social media, you might notice when you're on hour 8 of doom scrolling and you're starting to type in all caps, that maybe it's time to put the phone down. And so that could be a good way to titrate and regulate your social media usage so that you aren't driving yourself nuts.
Well, I think one thing that strikes me about what you're sharing here is that it's in many ways an argument for maintaining interaction with real people, right? That there is, in some ways, in the loneliness epidemic that where we all find ourselves in, with the rise of tech and so many opportunities for you to stay secluded and just communicate with people digitally, doesn't help a journey to being kinder to yourself or loving yourself.
I'm so glad you brought that up, and I'm a little embarrassed that I didn't say it myself, but thank you for prodding me. I think I've spent the last six plus years working on a book, a kind of sequel to 10% Happier, and this book, which I hope comes out next year if I can get my act together, and I'm trying to motivate myself with self-compassion. This book really is about love, a kind of, and again, I keep quoting the TED Talk because the TED Talk really is the blueprint for the book. It's a kind of unified field theory of love, which is on the one hand, self-compassion, self-love, these inner skills that improve your inner weather. And then what scientists have called, on the other hand, social fitness, this set of skills for cultivating and deepening and maintaining relationships with other people in all aspects of your life, from friendships to work relationships to romantic relationships to your family, to what scientists call micro interactions, which can have a real impact. These little interactions you have with a barista or the male person, that these can have a real impact on your psychology. And so thinking about inner management and outer cultivation of relationships and how they work together to create this virtuous upward spiral. And, in an individualistic culture where we are, thanks to technology, which technology, has many good aspects to it, but one of the negative ones is that it's put individualism on steroids, where we're kind of self-focused, not interacting with other human beings. This, I think, is really at the root of the unprecedented anxiety, depression, suicide, addiction, and loneliness we're seeing in our culture right now. And if you can start to focus on not only on self-love, but on the inexorable outcome of self-love, which is improved relationships, if you can get more mindful and deliberate about cultivating positive relationships in your life, that's going to it will help you inoculate you against the political tumult, against some of the more negative aspects of social media. It is just a protective layer that is, in my view, unquestionable.
Well, so much of what you've shared has been sort of grounded in your approach to meditation and your use of meditation as a tool in supporting your journey in self-love. And we have a question from Josh R., who also practices meditation. And their question is, did you find as you deepened your meditation practice, there was an inflection point where the more self-aware you become, the more you realize how neurotic the mind is?
That's actually, that's a great question, Josh. And it's a common bump that people hit early in their meditation practice. You keep bumping up against it, but especially early on, people are interested in mindfulness meditation, which again, it gives you a kind of a more powerful microscope on your inner life, so that you're not so owned by it. So that is one of how I would describe the benefits of mindfulness meditation, where you get interested in what's happening between your ears, so that whatever neurotic obsession or powerful emotion happens to flit through the mind doesn't lead you to lots of reflexive negative behavior. A lot of people get interested in this because it's been shown to reduce anxiety and depression and stress. And one of the things you see quite quickly, and this is why the early stages can be so cultish and awkward, is you really see it can feel like, oh wait, this is making me more anxious. And that is not because it's making you more anxious. It's just it's like turning on a black light in a hotel room. You ever see those legendary news reports where they turn a black light on in the hotel room? A friend of mine actually did those stories. You're seeing disgusting stuff. Well, that's just the nature of seeing your own mind. There's a great expression from the writer John Barth. Self-knowledge is always bad news. I don't think that's always true, but it's true to a large extent. But don't be fooled. The seeing it is what is empowering, because as you get more familiar with the chaos and cacophony of your own mind, you're able to ride it in a smoother, more supple way. But the process, in my experience, I've only been meditating for about 15 years, but I spend a lot of time with people who've been meditating for 50, 60 years. From what, in my own experience, and from what I've heard from my friends who are really deep into the pool meditators, is that it is just a process of, I'm using this word somewhat tongue in cheek, just ongoing humiliation. You just seeing over time how ridiculous the mind is. And that word ridiculous, my teacher, Joseph Goldstein, who is this amazing guy who's coming up on 81 and has been meditating since he was 21, he uses that word ridiculous all the time, because really when things are going well, over time you start to develop a sense of humor about it. You start to kind of get over yourself in a really deep way. And that's why the Dalai Lama is always laughing. A big part of it is because you can't sit in meditation for decades without seeing how ridiculous this all is. And that's really helpful.
It feels like a dose of humor. It makes such a difference here. Well, Gabby R. has a question about just your personal journey and whether there was a moment when you felt like you were regressing instead of progressing, and how you personally navigated that. And I guess this is post the 360 review post, the things you already shared.
Progress and then progression and then regression is just, in my experience, is like, that's just part of the deal. You learn something useful and you make a few strides, and then you just screw it up and think that you're a wretch. And then somebody in your life, either you have to have the inner resources or the outer allies to, talk you off the ledge and get back in the game. And so absolutely, I'm just thinking of an example that I've been writing about recently. This happened many years ago, but after I had my 360 in 2018, I ended up meeting this much younger person than me who became my assistant. Her name was Grace. And it turned out that she actually had a lot of experience with self-compassion. And she started sending me these assignments that made a huge difference to me. And she was helping me integrate self-compassion into my life. And so she went from being my assistant to really becoming a kind of teacher for me. And then at one point we got in a big fight because she said something totally innocuous, and it just triggered me. There's a great expression: if it's hysterical, it's historical. And she just said something that triggered some historical stuff for me, and I handled it so poorly. And I'm just bringing this up because it's an example of regression. And, I think one of the tricks of self-improvement, for lack of a better term, really is learning how to handle the inevitable mistakes. I don't know if this is entirely apropos, but one of the things I think about is if you're doing self-improvement or personal growth or spiritual development, whatever you want to call it, if you're doing it correctly, you should always feel like you have been a complete idiot your whole life up until 6 weeks ago. Like you should just be constantly learning stuff and reevaluating. and hopefully in a fun way with other people, doing it as a team sport. To me, this is just a very exciting and interesting way to live.
Well, I feel like conversation has been chock full of just so many thoughtful tips and insights into just how you think about all of this. And you shared that you have this book coming out. Are there any other exciting things on the horizon? Where else can we see you next?
Well, I host a podcast, as you referenced. That's a huge deal for me. That's a huge part of my work. I also have a little, I've been experimenting on Substack, so I have a little community going there. We had our 5-month anniversary this week. So it's pretty new.
Congratulations.
And yeah, I would love to have people sign up there. There's a free version and a little paid version if you want to get direct access to me. So that's a total experiment, but I'm really excited about it. And I also would be very excited to finish this book finally, because I have like 4 other books I want to write after it.
Well, and any insight into what those books might be about, or what sort of topics you're eager to
get into? Yes, I have a book. I'm really interested in how to apply all of this at work. And so we have a series we've done on the podcast that's been very popular. It's a kind of occasional series that we bring back once in a while called Sanely Ambitious, where we talk about all of the psychological and contemplative tools that can make you better at work. And so we interview lots of people who've given TED Talks, including Adam Grant, and many, many other people. And so that's interesting to me, to kind of do a really practical book about how to get better at work. I talked about Joseph Goldstein, who I have just so much respect and affection for. And he has these little phrases he uses in his teaching. These just pithy little phrases, like self-knowledge is always bad news. That's one of his things he says a lot. And I want to write a book where it's like not quite a coffee table book, but a book that goes through all of the phrases and explains them. And it's kind of a backdoor way to really get at deep Dharma, deep Buddhism, but in a very fun, snackable, user-friendly way.
Well, Dan, this has been really a treat. There are so many more questions I could ask. There are so many more questions from our members that we didn't get to, but we have reached our time. Thank you so much for being with us.
Total pleasure. Thank you.